Order. Before we begin, can I remind members that they are expected to wear face coverings when they are not speaking in the debate, which is in line with current government guidance and that of the House of Commons Commission. I remind members that they are asked by the House to have a COVID lateral flow test twice a week if coming onto the parliamentary estate. This can be done either at the testing centre in the House or at home. Please also give each other and members of staff space when seated and when entering and leaving the room. I will call Alistair Carmichael to move the motion, and I will then incorporate others who wish to speak. Order. Alistair Carmichael to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Angela. I beg to move that the House has considered the matter of the Post Office Historic Shortfalls Scheme. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to serve with you in the chair, and I welcome the Minister as a substitute for the Minister who has executive responsibility for this department to his place. Dame Angela, I have a number of specific concerns about the Post Office's administration of the Historic Shortfall Scheme, and I will come to them in due course. But I would say this to the Minister and to his colleagues in government, that if he takes nothing else away from this debate today, I want him to take this away. And it is that it has become apparent to me, and I have no doubt to others in this House as well, from assisting constituents in relation to the HSS, that the culture within the Post Office still leaves a great deal to be desired. And I say that, and it is significant, because it's probably not unique for the Post Office to have a poor culture. But I say that because it has been accepted by ministers, and in fact I think it's now a universally accepted truth, that what happened in relation to the Horizon scandal was allowed to happen, and happened for as long as it did, because of the culture within the Post Office. And the basic concern I have is that if the culture is still not right, then this could happen again. So that really is, I think, the opportunity for ministers here. We don't expect ministers to be responsible for the day-to-day management of this scheme or anything else within the Post Office. There are plenty of people who are rather handsomely paid to do that. But ministers can insist and should insist on seeing that there has been a demonstrable change of culture. This point about culture... of course, yes.
Very grateful. Thank you for being involved in this debate. What he says is absolutely right, and this mirrors almost entirely what we did with Lloyds Bank. Yeah. When we asked them to do their own homework in their compensation scheme. It was a complete travesty, proven as such. It has to be completely redone, a cost of hundreds of millions of pounds to Lloyds themselves, and obviously massive distress to their victims. This must be done impartially. Do you not agree?
Alistair Carmichael.
Yes, of course, except for the Post Office, it wouldn't be the cost of themselves, because there's only one shareholder, and that's the Secretary of State. So it would ultimately come to the taxpayer, and I will touch on that in a few minutes, very briefly. This is just half an hour.
It wasn't just the fact that the system let the people down, it was the mental and health issues that the people suffered as a result. Some of those who ended their life early, took illness, depression, lost all they had. The implications of all this here go far and above beyond that.
Alistair Carmichael.
Absolutely, and indeed, as I'll come to in a few minutes, the particular constituent, Eleanor Kimmett, who was for many years the sub-postmistress in Stromness, is somebody who illustrates that truth rather better than anybody I can think of. This question about culture, though, I thought was perhaps just me being, as I can occasionally be, a kind of grumpy guy after a bad meeting. But I had a recent lengthy discussion with the National Federation for Sub-Postmasters, and they, in correspondence to me, put it in these terms. The culture of the Post Office of today and tomorrow must be significantly different to that of the past. In a recent survey of postmasters conducted by the NFSP, only 29% believe they are being listened to by Post Office today. In terms of resetting the relationship between Post Office and the network, postmasters gave Post Office a score of 5 out of 10 for their progress so far. In relation to the administration of the Historic Shortfall Scheme, the Executive Director with responsibility for the Historic Shortfall Scheme, Derek Salter, was left in a position in July of this year where the Post Office Board did not renew his contract. As a consequence, and we still don't have that contract renewed, and this is something that I would like to hear from the Minister either today or in due course in correspondence, that has left the administration of this scheme rudderless, and we need to know what the intentions of the board. If the board are not going to renew the contract of the person that they put in charge of it, then they should at least be able to come forward and tell us what they intend to do instead. But throughout this whole sorry affair, the strategy of the Post Office has been to use public money to outgun the sub-postmasters. And the settlement with the sub-postmasters was forced on them by the Post Office, and this in the context of the Post Office knowing at latest in 2013 that many of the convictions that were there were unsafe. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Can I thank him for raising this debate? But it's actually worse than that, wouldn't you agree? They spent £100 million of public money to defend the indefensible. Now, he raised earlier that the government is the only shareholder. Doesn't it beg the question what the government shareholder and what ministers were doing to actually stop the Post Office frittering away £100 million of public money?
Alistair Carmichael.
Well, it does, and you know, that's something that has to be examined and established in the fullness of time. And it's probably more than we're going to achieve today, but it is still, I think, one of the outstanding questions in relation to this. But the question of public money being used to defend the indefensible, as the Right Honourable Gentleman says, I think does kind of come to the heart of the way in which the historic shortfall scheme is being administered. And this was something that hit me like a bolt of lightning on the 23rd of November when I was part of a good faith meeting, and that is a term of art, it's not a description of what we actually went through, the good faith meeting with a representative from the legal firm acting for the Post Office, Herbert Smith Freehills. Now, I don't know what Herbert Smith Freehills would charge the Post Office for that 1 hour. Let me say the poor lawyer that they put up for it, I think, certainly earned her money in a way that she hadn't anticipated, perhaps, at the beginning of it. And I pick my words with some care, because checking their website today, I see I was at university with their chief executive. But I'm almost left feeling, actually, that if the Post Office just paid out everybody what they asked for, then they would actually probably end up still better off financially than they are in pursuing it in the way that they are. There was nobody on that call who was able to explain the position with regard to the Post Office. We were told right at the start that there would be no recording of this meeting. In a good faith meeting, Dame Angela, it seems a quite remarkable way of demonstrating your good faith. And I know myself, as a former legal practitioner, albeit that it was over 20 years ago, and I would probably know just enough to be dangerous these days, that there are two ways in which lawyers can be used in these occasions. They can be used as an advisor and indeed as a conduit for good information, or they can be used to insulate the client from the anger of the claimant. And it was pretty clear to me, from the fact that Post Office put nobody up for that so-called good faith meeting, that they see this as being the latter rather than the former. The meeting involved myself, Anne Robertson, the principal of a JEP Robertson Solicitors in Orkney, who incidentally, as somebody who's instructed to administer an estate, has gone above and beyond anything that anybody could reasonably expect of a solicitor in that situation. Her client is in fact now the estate of the late Eleanor Kimmett, who was the postmistress in Stromness from the 31st of July 1989 until she resigned in October 2008, essentially because she could really take no more. I first had a contact with Eleanor in my early days as a Member of Parliament when I started talking about post offices, and she got in touch and said, well, if you're interested, come in and see me and I'll tell you what it's really like. And she did. She was you know, we all talk about the role of sub-postmasters and postmistresses, but Eleanor Kimmett was somebody who just instinctively took an enormous pride from the fact that she was part of an institution like the post office, and that allowed her to help so many people, especially older people, within the community. But she was caught in the Horizon scandal, and she was absolutely devastated by the apparent disappearance of the cash within the new computerised system. She had a long sequence of relatively small losses, which gradually increased in causing her enormous anxiety. I've spoken to her sons about this, and they tell me she balanced her books every Wednesday. They well remember the gradual change in her. She went from being a happy, competent, outgoing mother to somebody who was withdrawn, quiet and reserved. And on Wednesday night, the balancing night for the post office, instead of coming home for the usual family meal, she started not to want to take part in that, and she would instead just eat a few biscuits and have a glass of wine. So that was something that she was undergoing. That was a change that it wrought in her as she was making up the losses from the Horizon system from her own pocket. She asked Post Office on many occasions for help, but she was always told that the system was infallible and that if money was going missing, it wasn't her, then it must be her staff. Her staff had all worked for her for long periods of time, and in fact included her mother and her husband. And in May 2002, matters came to a head when there was a shortfall of £3,000. She again contacted Post Office and again was told that the system was infallible. She inquired whether other offices were experiencing similar difficulties, and she was told no, there were no others, and that it was her problem and her responsibility. This was a significant amount of money for her and her husband to have to take from their own savings to put into the business. She eventually gave up the post office in 2008, and in fact, 1 year today, 1 year ago today, on the 13th of December, just 6 months after she had made an application to the Historic Shortfall Scheme, she died. Her two sons and her former employees have no doubt that Eleanor's life was badly affected by the actions of the post office, and that she was devastated that she felt she could not continue in the job that she loved. So this brings me to my questions about the administration of the scheme. The concerns I have start, in fact, with the composition of what is called an application form. It should properly be regarded as a claim form, I think. The wording of the questions are clearly slanted towards fault and questions actions by employees completely unrelated to employment. The wording actively discourages and gives no space or invitation to specify what the experience of the applicants had been or the effect that it had had on them. The application form did not specify that this would be the only opportunity that she would be given to state her case, and no advice was given that she should in fact seek legal advice before completing and submitting what was in fact a legal claim. So, can we hear from the Minister or the Post Office who drafted this form? And there is no warning whatsoever that applicants, that any offer would be considered solely upon and restricted to the amount stated in the form. The form, it seems, is designed to steer the applicants away from any thought of compensation, even to this point of space given for the response. The question then arises of consequential loss. There is nothing in the form that would allow for the sort of compensation for which Eleanor should, in law, be entitled to, or have been entitled to. The application form asks postmasters to identify any alleged shortfall losses, as well as any other losses that are caused by the Horizon shortfall, namely consequential loss. This appears to limit any payment to the claimant to proven consequential loss as defined by the Post Office. There is no reference to compensation for anguish, upset or distress caused by their action. There is no reference within the form to any such payment. But in fact, the Post Office, in correspondence to me on the 22nd of December, then started talking about they were sympathetic, they apologised, but they could not extend the offer on the basis of the words of the information that is available at this stage. Now, these are the significant words. Having subsequently given them information about Eleanor Kimmett's loss, I would have expected them to entertain that, but there appears to be no opportunity for them to do so. Dame Angela, there is a lot more that I could probably say, but I'm aware that others want to make brief interventions in the debate, and I do want to make time available for the Minister to give the fullest possible answers. So at this stage, I just finish with this one final nugget from that good faith meeting on the 23rd of November. When at the end of that we indicated that in fact we weren't content with what we had been told, we wouldn't be accepting the offer, the representative of the solicitors acting for the Post Office then turned round and said, be aware that if you go to the next stage, then it is possible that the sum that is offered could be reduced or withdrawn completely. If ever there was a point when we understood the lack of respect that still pertains between Post Office, their representatives and the sub-postmasters who we represent, that was it. That was the disgrace. That's why it's got to change.
Kevin Jones, and I'm hoping that call the Minister at 20 past.
Thanks for raising this debate today. And he uses the issue around culture. I've been involved in this issue for over 10 years. It first came to light by Tom Brown, one of my constituents, came to me with a similar case where someone who was a highly respected individual in the local community was suddenly accused by the Post Office of stealing £86,000 because of the Horizon system. He spent 2 years of hell, I would describe it as, only then to go before a judge at Newcastle Crown Court, arrived at the door to be told by the Post Office that they were not pursuing the case. In that time, he'd have gone bankrupt, paid £86,000 back to the Post Office. And in the last 10 years I've been dealing with this and his case and many others, the culture which is described by the Right Honourable Gentleman is spot on. It's arrogance, it's dismissiveness, it's actually a cover-up as well, which is... We're now into this scheme, which I think just needs abolishing, frankly, because it's designed, like a lot of the things have done with this, the Post Office, is to put the onus back on the individual postmaster and mistress, but also to reduce the liability of the Post Office. And you only have to see that, for example, this scheme was only open for 3 months in 2020, and if you didn't get your claim in by then, you couldn't get a claim forward. So that was designed to reduce the number down. So the aim is to reduce the liability. Now, the Post Office have got no idea what it budgeted in its accounts for £35 million of compensation. The figures now are estimated something over £300 million of compensation. The other thing about this scheme as well is it excludes the 555 people, including my constituent Tom Brown, who took the action against the Post Office, and that was the only way we got the actual truth, is when it went to court. And if you follow that case, the government, and I've got to say, the government used £100 million of public money to actually try and stop the case going forward. They had to settle those claimants because they ran out of money, because there was this, and I describe it as a tsunami of money from the Post Office. So what is needed, and I do welcome the WMS today about those that are convicted that can be included in a compensation scheme. But this scheme needs abolishing. It needs putting to one side. And what we need, Dame Angela, is a comprehensive scheme outside of the Post Office. The government are going to have to put in place a scheme for everybody, including these people that have already put forward, but including the 555 who took the class action. Because without them taking that, we would have not got the discovery of the lies, the deceit and cover-up which was taken by the Post Office. And I'm sorry, I don't accept the government washing its hands and saying, oh, well, we're the Post Office is an arm's length from the government. They had an active shareholder on that board who did absolutely nothing to stop this scandal going forward. So I would call for scrapping this scheme, putting in place a comprehensive scheme which covers everyone to be compensated. Yes, it might cost hundreds of millions, but it's going to cost hundreds of millions because it was not the post office and postmistress and master's fault. It was the government and the post office's fault.
Minister Freeman.
Thank you very much, Dame Angela, for the chance to serve under your chairmanship today. And could I congratulate members for their contributions today and the honourable member opposite for raising this. I am here with apologies from the Small Business Minister, the member for Sutton Cheam, who's called into the House on primary legislation elsewhere. But I have to say it is a chance I relish to respond on behalf of the Department of Business, having myself experienced in my constituency the appalling injustice that the sub-postmasters suffered. And in one village in my constituency, Gressenhall, I saw the misery, the family disruption, the hell, colleagues have referred to, that the sub-postmasters were put through in a frankly disgraceful episode of institutional contempt for the little guy, if I can put it like that, at the bottom of the system. And I'm very pleased today that, as honourable members have remarked, we are announcing through a written ministerial statement, and there'll be an oral statement subject to the Speaker tomorrow, in which we will set out the government's commitment to fully fund the HSS scheme and the losses for those who have not yet been compensated. Yeah, happy to give it.
I'm very grateful. You raise a
Mr.
very
Hollingbrooke.
fair point, but so does my honourable friend, the member for North Durham. This scheme excludes those that took part in group litigation. It is entirely unfair, unjust. Lee Castleton, not one of my constituents, but somebody I've tried to help through a third party, he got £28,000 in compensation. He lost over £400,000. It is simply unfair. It cannot persist with this route for compensation.
Minister Freeman.
Well, thank you, my honourable friend, for that intervention. Obviously, my colleague in the Department of Business is the lead minister on this, and I will raise that point with him. For the record in a moment, just want to make clear what has happened, and those who did settle have a settlement. We're tackling today those who weren't subject to a settlement, but he makes an important point. This must be fair, must be seen to be fair, and I wanted to start, Dame Angela, by just echoing the government's support for the point about culture. It is absolutely vital that the painful and difficult lessons from this disgraceful saga are properly learned, and let the message go forth from this dispatch box that we expect the Post Office to tackle that culture change properly. I'm delighted that there is a culture change programme, 2 new non-exec directors. But this is not a tick box exercise. This is a serious commitment. An organisation wholly owned by the taxpayer delivers properly and learns the lessons from this disgraceful saga. And I would, from my point of view, I dealt with this issue when I was a minister in this department in the coalition in 2015. What I saw seemed to me to be an institutional obfuscation, institutional defence of injustice, and all of those who conspired in that should hang their heads in shame. And the honourable member opposite mentions a law firm. I would just signal that some lawyers have stepped up to the mark on this, and in particular, Patrick Green, QC at Henderson Chambers, who worked pro bono to help many of the sub-postmasters, Neil Hudgell at Hudgell Solicitors and Freets, who did tremendous work speaking up for those who didn't have a voice. And it's only because of the bravery of those sub-postmasters and their lawyers that we're where we are today. Of course, it is good news that we've announced that funding. I don't want to focus on that, though, today, because the Minister should rightly, he's campaigned hard on it, and he will speak to the House tomorrow. But I just wanted Dame Angela to set the record straight for those watching or reading this later in terms of where we are today. As everyone here will be aware, the Post Office introduced that Horizon scheme in early 2000 and subsequently recorded shortfalls in cash at Post Office branches, which the Post Office then blamed on sub-postmasters. Completely unfairly, it subsequently turned out, and it resulted in horrific suffering. Not just the losses for the small business, in terms of the small businesses that sub-postmasters are running, but the family losses, the divorces, the depression, the mental health, the anxiety, and not to mention also in many rural areas, the loss of a facility that is crucial to rural communities. Many were sent to prison. This is a disgrace, an absolute disgrace, and it's very important that the lessons are learnt properly and that the culture that conspired to allow that to happen is seriously changed. In 2017, a group litigation order was brought against Post Office by the 555 postmasters. The postmasters won 2 landmark trials in 2019 and reached a settlement with the Post Office for £57.75 million. And those court cases and subsequent cases in the appeal courts have demonstrated just how wrong the Post Office was to behave in the way that it did. It has apologised and is now working to overhaul its culture to address the findings of Mr Justice Fraser. Very quick.
They had to settle because they ran out of money. And my constituent Tom Brown got £20,000 in compensation. He paid £86,000 back to the Post Office. Can he tell me where that £86,000 is and why Tom isn't entitled to getting that back?
Well, the honourable member makes a really important point. I will raise that specifically with the Minister, and perhaps he could address it in his statement tomorrow. And I wanted just to, on behalf of the government, express our deep sympathies to those sub-postmasters who've been referenced here today, to Tom and to those in Scotland and those in York and those around the country. This is an injustice that urgently needs to be tackled very quickly.
Alistair Carmichael.
To demonstrate the change of culture and good faith would be for Post Office actually to start the whole process from the beginning again, instead of insisting that people who have made applications under a flawed process will have to see them through to the end and get less than they are entitled to as a consequence.
Minister Freeman.
I understand the point that the honourable member is making. Let me just include, for those on the record, the history of how we got to this situation today. As part of that settlement in 2019, the Post Office committed to putting in place a scheme for those postmasters who were not part of that settlement and who didn't have criminal convictions related to the Horizon scheme. And the historic shortfall scheme, HSS, was set up to meet that commitment. It's an important step. It opened in May 2020 and closed to applications later that year. The Post Office, to be fair, did make significant efforts, quite rightly, to reach out to all postmasters, 7,000 individual letters to current postmasters and a further 20,000 to former postmasters. I think it's fair to say the Post Office was quite surprised. I don't think any of us in this room will have been by the response, and the scheme received over 2,300 eligible applications. I hear the points that the honourable member have made opposite about the nature of that form, and I haven't myself, because I'm not the lead minister on this, looked at it, but he makes an important point which I will raise with the minister. The form needs to make clear to people what they're entitled to and not discourage them from understanding their rights, which are long overdue in terms of being enforced. That HSS meant that the cost of the scheme went beyond, and that response, beyond what the Post Office could afford, and the Post Office turned to the government as its 100% shareholder. And my honourable friend, the Minister, the member for Sutton Cheam, has set out that the government will provide sufficient financial support to Post Office to ensure that the historical shortfall scheme can proceed properly and that those people are fully compensated. I understand that raises a question about the fairness for those who settled out of court, which is a point that the Minister will no doubt want to address. The Post Office is contributing from its own funds. Decisions on application,
£1,000,000, the estimate. 2,300 applications, that's £130,000 each. Lee Castleton got 28,000. My honourable friend's constituency got 20,000. That just cannot be right.
Minister Freeman.
My honourable friend makes a powerful point, which I'm sure the Minister will want to address. One of the things I wanted to mention is the speed. When the government steps up and says, we are now going to fully fund this, it is incumbent on the Post Office to pull its finger out and get on with processing more quickly. And I understand the intention is that all of these will be claimed, vast majority within months by the spring. All of them will be claimed within the year. Long overdue that is. Let me just close by picking up a couple of the points that honourable members have made. The point about the board, I would ask the Minister to write to the honourable member for Orkney and Shetland on. The honourable member for Strangford raised the same points about his constituents, which I wanted to put on record. The member for North Durham, let me share the government's apologies to Tom Brown and others in his constituency, and I take the point about lessons for ministers and lessons for the department as well. And my honourable friend, the member for Thirsk and Waltham, makes a very good point. We cannot have unaccountable quangos marking their own homework, and there are really important lessons here about accountability. Let me just close by saying I think it is good news that the government is making a commitment to fully fund this scheme, but there are other issues that still need to be sorted to make clear this, A, never happens again, and B, that the injustices are properly resolved.
The question is that this House has considered the Post Office historical shortfall scheme. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no.